The smell of Lilith still clung to the air. People had barely left the reception. Half-drunk wine glasses, sympathy cards unopened, black dresses trailing out the front door. And there I was still in black staring at a document my own daughter had slid across the kitchen island. "This is what Dad would have wanted," she said calmly. "It's just a legal restructure. You'll be taken care of. Taken care of, like a burden." Like an afterthought, my hands shook as I scanned the papers. The house, the vineyard, even the rights to the Whitmore White label, all reassigned to them. My daughters. My flesh and blood. But the cruelest part, it had been filed the day before his funeral. They had waited until I was dressed in grief before they made their move. And as I looked into my eldest daughter's cold, practiced smile, I realized I wasn't family anymore. I was an obstacle, but what they didn't know was that just months ago, their father and I had rewritten a legacy of our own, one that would make sure everything they built on betrayal would rot greater than if you've ever been betrayed by your own blood. Like, comment, and subscribe. You deserve your own ending. Eleanor White never saw herself as a businesswoman, not in the way people often define one-sharp suits, boardrooms, investment decks. She was the kind of woman who brought warmth into cold places, who made spaces feel like home. At 42, she carried herself with a quiet elegance, loose curls of silver already threading her dark hair, soft linen shirts smudged with ink and paint, and eyes that held stories even when she said nothing. She used to be a teacher, art specifically, the kind who stayed after school to help a struggling student finish a portfolio, the kind who turned the school play into a local legend every spring. But that version of Eleanor ended at 23, the day she fell in love with Charles White. He was 6 years older. All ambition and calloused hands from harvesting grapes on land no one believed in yet. They met at a town fair. He spilled a cup of red wine on her blouse and offered a bottle as apology. The bottle had no label, just a piece of masking tape with CW91 scrawled across it. But the way he spoke about soil and oak and patience, she fell in love with him the way vines grow toward sunlight slowly, irreversibly. In the early days of Whitmore White Vineyards, there was no brand, just a tin-roofed barn, a battered truck, and Eleanor painting labels by hand late into the night. She wasn't just decorating bottles. She was building MYTHOLAGIES. Each label had a name. First Bloom, Storm Harvest. The quiet vintage. And under the name, a short line of poetry. Just a few words, enough to make people pause before drinking. People began collecting them, not just for the wine, but for the feeling. By year 3, their wine was being sold at local boutiques. By year 7, they had their first major distributor. By year 15, Whitmore White was a regional institution. Eleanor's dreams shifted, never shrank. She gave up her tenure offer at the university, gave up directing summer theater camps. Instead, she raised 2 daughters and ran a business. Claire came first, fierce, independent, already skeptical of fairy tales by the time she was 5. Morgan came 5 years later, softer, dreamier, more like Eleanor in temperament. Eleanor balanced motherhood with moonlit inventory, checks, and early morning harvests. She did payroll in her pajamas and fundraising galas in handmade dresses. She wasn't perfect, but she was present. There are photos of her back then, covered in grape juice, laughing in the mud with toddlers on her hip. Reading The Velveteen Rabbit to Claire during inventory. Painting watercolor swatches while Morgan napped in a wine crate beside her. To the public, Charles was the face, but Eleanor was the story. In interviews, Charles always said, "My wife is the soul of this vineyard. I build things. She gives them meaning." The brand at its peak wasn't just about wine. It was about home, about memory. About heart. And Eleanor was at the center of it all. She wasn't flashy. She drove the same pale green Volvo for 2 decades. She still wore the emerald ring Charles gave her in their second year of marriage, bought secondhand from a pawn shop. She preferred handwritten letters to emails. She knew every grape picker's name. She brought blankets to anyone sick during harvest and every Thanksgiving. She cooked 3 pies, one for each of her girls, and one for whoever didn't have a place to go. She believed in small beauty. And giving more than you get. And building things with love, even if they didn't always last. But make no mistake, Eleanor was not weak. She handled supplier disputes with steely grace. She negotiated vendor contracts while simultaneously managing Morgan's food allergies and Claire's teenage rebellion. She wasn't the kind to raise her voice, but if she went silent during a meeting, people knew they had pushed too far. She had a memory like a ledger and an intuition like a sixth sense. And when Charles got sick pancreatic cancer, the silent kind, she didn't flinch. She took over operations quietly, delegated, reorganized, protected what they had built. She never asked for applause. Just respect and loyalty. And that was the cruelest part, because Eleanor had never betrayed anyone, not her daughters, not her husband, not the vineyard. She had spent nearly 2 decades holding it all together through droughts, downturns, distributors pulling out, staff turnover, market shifts. She carried the emotional weight of the brand and the family on her back. So when betrayal came, not from strangers, not from competitors, but from her own blood, it wasn't just painful. It was surgical. Like someone had carved out the story of her life and rewritten the ending. But Eleanor White was not a woman who collapsed. She was a woman who watched, who waited. And when the time came, she would not shout. She would not beg. She would simply reclaim the story, one quiet sentence at a time. Claire White was always the one they said would go far. From the moment she won her 3rd grade spelling bee in front of a standing ovation, people assumed she was destined for something bigger than the vineyard. And maybe she was. Sharp-eyed, fast-talking, and effortlessly polished. Claire was the kind of daughter Eleanor once believed would change the world. But as the years went on, Eleanor began to wonder, what exactly did Claire want to change? At 35, Claire White had the resume of a rising titan. Valedictorian, Ivy League business degree, junior analyst at a prestigious consulting firm, then a fast-track MBA at NYU Stern, followed by a position at a luxury food and beverage conglomerate in Manhattan. Her LinkedIn sparkled with bullet points: market expansion, brand reinvention, strategic realignment. To outsiders, she was everything the modern wine industry needed. She dressed like it, structured neutral blazers, minimalist jewelry, Louboutin heels, and muted tones. She moved like it, decisive steps, no wasted gestures. And she spoke like it, every sentence landing like a bullet point. But the closer you stood, the more you could hear the edge under her tone. Claire hadn't been back home in years. She said it was too slow, that the vineyard wasn't scalable, that the industry had changed. She spoke about the place like it was a relic, something quaint, something dusty, something her mother should have let go of a long time ago. What she never said, but what Eleanor always felt, was that Claire resented her, not for the wine. Not for the business, but for what Eleanor meant to the brand. It was subtle, but constant. Every article about Whitmore White opened with Eleanor's name, even when Claire had helped secure a major distributor. Every wine tasting featured her mother's artwork, her poetry, her vision. Even the labels, every single bottle Claire poured at industry events, still carried that handwritten touch. The legacy Claire wanted to inherit was undeniably built on someone else's story, and it ate at her. Claire believed in numbers, analytics, profit margins, Vertical integration. She once told a friend over dinner that romance is nice, but scalability is power. That mindset served her well in the city. It made her dangerous when she came home. The return wasn't dramatic. Just a polite phone call. An offer to help streamline operations while Charles was in treatment. She framed it as support said. She wanted to give back to the family to ease Eleanor's burden, and Eleanor, exhausted, grieving, and hopeful for reconnection, welcomed her. With open arms. Claire arrived with Morgan in tow. She said they'd bring the vineyard into the future. Eleanor didn't yet realize she was being pushed into the past. What no one knew, not even Morgan, was that Claire was drowning. Her divorce, filed quietly 2 years earlier, had come with strings: a high-rise apartment in her ex's name, a frozen joint account, a lifestyle she could no longer sustain, and a settlement clause. No alimony if she remarried within 5 years. Claire was bleeding money and desperate to regain control of something. Anything. The vineyard wasn't just a family legacy anymore. It was a lifeline. So Claire began moving pieces, slowly, strategically. She convinced Morgan to sign on as co-executive. 2 votes are stronger than 1, she said. She offered Eleanor time off. You deserve rest. She restructured meetings, replacing monthly roundtables with private reviews between just the sisters. Then came the real moves. Vendor contracts redirected, banking access reconfigured, legal titles quietly reassigned. Her mother's name faded inch by inch from the center of the brand. Claire told herself she was protecting the business, that Eleanor was sentimental, that grief made her reckless, that Charles, even in his absence, would have agreed with her. But somewhere inside she knew. She was tired of waiting for a throne built with someone else's hands. She didn't just want the vineyard. She wanted it without her mother in the picture. The final stroke was almost laughably simple. A set of documents, pre-signed by Charles during his final weeks under the claim of asset simplification, filed just before the funeral, approved by a notary who owed Claire a favor, buried in legal jargon thick enough to hide poison. It wasn't theft. It was a transition of power, one that left Eleanor with nothing but a token consulting title and a monthly stipend barely enough to live on. Claire called it business, but it was betrayal in cashmere, and in her mind, it was justified. She had waited long enough. She had paid her dues in school, in life, in silence. She had watched her mother be worshipped while she be executor, the strategist, the future CEO, was constantly second guest. Now the vineyard would be hers. She would modernize it, scale it, maybe even sell it, turn it into the kind of empire she always believed it could be. No more poetry. No more hand-painted nostalgia. No more Eleanor. Just white vineyards, streamlined, global, efficient. But Claire forgot something crucial. She forgot who Eleanor White really was. Not a victim, not a bystander. Not a sentimental relic clinging to fading dreams. Eleanor had built the roots. And roots run deep. The office used to smell like crayons and crushed grapes. Eleanor can still remember the early days before the awards, before the investors, before anyone believed in the vineyard but her and Charles. Back then, the winery office was barely more than a drafty room above the barrel room. The floors creaked, the heater groaned, and Claire, at 7, would sit at Eleanor's feet legs swinging under the desk, coloring on old invoice sheets. There was no daycare, no time, no balance. Eleanor brought her daughters wherever she went. They grew up between cork boards and grape crates, reading fairy tales beneath spreadsheets and supplier notes. She'd braid Claire's hair between calls, let her stamp grape-colored ink on test labels, taught her how to smell the tannins, how to know when a grape was just shy of perfect. It's not just about taste, she'd say. It's about memory. A wine should remind you of something you forgot you loved. Claire would roll her eyes, but she always listened. Eleanor was the emotional anchor of the vineyard. Charles was the builder, the one with the big plans and the spreadsheets and the vision. But Eleanor, she was the soul, and she poured that same soul into her children. Claire was always different, brilliant, competitive, restless. She was the kind of child who asked about profit. Margins at 12 and shadowed wine reps at 15. Eleanor admired her ambition, even when it felt like Claire was always 2 steps ahead, chasing a future no one could quite see yet. But it was Eleanor who gave Claire her first office. Corner of the old storage room, cleaned out and repainted pale lavender. Eleanor hung a corkboard shaped like a grape cluster. Left a note on the tiny desk, CEO in training. When Claire was 16, Eleanor brought her to her first board meeting. She didn't have to, but Claire begged. And Eleanor believed in exposure. She sat quietly, took notes, asked better questions than most of the men in the room. By 18, Claire was leading client pitches with Eleanor standing proudly behind her. But there were cracks. Even then, Claire never quoted her mother's poems at tastings. She rolled her eyes at the handwritten labels, said they were quaint. She laughed when Eleanor suggested releasing a vintage themed around childhood memories. We're not selling emotions. Mom, we're selling alcohol. Eleanor never argued. She chalked it up to youth, to impatience, to difference. She thought love would be enough to bridge the gap. Then came Morgan, 5 years younger, softer in every way. Where Claire pushed, Morgan yielded. She loved painting in the vineyard with Eleanor, loved writing haikus to tape onto the wine crates. She wasn't ambitious, not like Claire, but she was deeply present. She loved the vineyard for what it was, not what it could become. Claire treated Morgan like an understudy, not unkindly, but with an edge of command. Morgan followed because it was easier, because Claire was convincing, because their family taught them loyalty was love. In those early years, Eleanor watched the sisters grow up within the vineyard's walls. She believed the vineyard would be their shared inheritance. Not just the land, but the values behind it. The legacy. She taught them both how to taste soil. How to read clouds before a harvest. How to speak to a vendor with kindness. Even when saying no. She believed she was building something unbreakable. But she missed the subtle distance growing in Claire's eyes, the quiet resentment that formed each time Charles praised Eleanor's artistry, the growing hunger to be not just part of the legacy, but to own it. Eleanor never saw it coming, not because she was blind, but because she loved her daughter too much to believe betrayal could come from that direction. Charles' illness brought them all back together. At first, Eleanor saw it as a blessing wrapped in tragedy. Claire returned home, as did Morgan. They said they wanted to help, to step in, to prepare for the future. Eleanor let herself hope just a little that the vineyard could become a shared love again, that maybe, finally, her daughters would see its heart, not just its books. She opened her doors. She handed over access. She let Claire run board meetings, negotiate with suppliers, review marketing. She thought, this is what trust looks like. But she didn't know that every open door was a knife waiting to be turned. The shift was quiet. Claire started deleting Eleanor's drafts of press releases. Told her the poetry wasn't landing with new demographics. Offered her a creative advisor role, less responsibility. She said, more freedom. Eleanor said yes, believing it was temporary, believing Claire knew better, believing her daughter wouldn't betray her. Morgan said little, but her eyes always lingered when Eleanor left the room. Eleanor mistook it for grief. It was guilt. It wasn't until Charles passed that the full picture came into view. The funeral wasn't even over when the papers were handed to her. A restructuring, a transfer of shares. A trust. All signed, all filed, all perfectly legal. And completely void. Of Eleanor, she stared at the signatures, Claire's, Morgan's, and Charles, not forged. Not falsified. Just manipulated. Documents buried in the fine print of palliative care forms, permissions signed under duress, under drugs, under pressure, and Claire stoic in black, flawless makeup, lips pressed in grief said, "It's what he wanted. We'll take it from here." Eleanor didn't speak. Not then. Because grief has a sound, and that day, it sounded like silence, but something inside her shifted, not broken, not shattered. Just realigned. She looked at her daughters, once cradled in her arms, now arm in control, and she knew they hadn't just taken the business. They had rewritten her story. It began with kindness. At least that's how Claire framed it. Greater than, "Let me take some of the load." "Mom, you're exhausted. Let me help." Eleanor, sleep deprived and stretched thin from hospital visits and vineyard logistics, accepted gratefully. After all, Claire had the degree, the business sense, the energy. And it wasn't permanent, just a few meetings, just while Charles was unwell. At first, it was helpful. Claire stepped in confidently, shaking hands, quoting margins, adjusting pricing structures with impressive ease. Vendors respected her. Investors liked her sharpness. But slowly, the narrative began to change. Meetings were rescheduled without Eleanor's input. Financial updates started, arriving late or not at all. Boardroom conversations turned from collaborative to curt. Claire stopped asking for advice and began issuing decisions. "We're shifting our demographic. We're tightening margins. It's time to modernize the brand." Each statement sounded smart on paper, but to Eleanor, they felt hollow, like echoes in a house that used to be full of music. Then came the label. Eleanor was walking through the print office when she saw it, stacked neatly on the designer's desk, a rebranded bottle. Mock-up. Gone were the hand-painted florals. Gone was the poetry. In its place, a minimalist white label with white vineyards and cold serif font. No mention of Whitmore. No mention of Eleanor. Her throat tightened. She picked it up gently, running her fingers over the texture. "Is this test print?" she asked the intern. Greater than, "Oh, Claire approved the redesign last week. Didn't she tell you?" She hadn't that night. Eleanor sat in Charles' room while he slept. She watched the man she'd loved for 40 years, his face thinner, his breathing shallow. He had once told her, "If I die first, you carry this forward. You know what it means." But now, she wasn't sure if he even knew what was happening. Claire handled all his medications. Claire reviewed the hospice care contracts. Claire had become the gatekeeper of information, even between Eleanor and her own husband. The next day, Eleanor opened the financial system and found her login credentials had expired. Greater than, "Oh, that's a glitch," Claire said, not looking up from her laptop. "We switched accounting software. I'll get you set up." She never did. Soon, even the vendors started treating her differently. Softer tones, pitying eyes. Invitations that used to come to her inbox now went to Claire's. A longtime supplier pulled her aside after a tasting. Greater than, "Are you okay?" He asked gently. "It feels like they're phasing you out." She laughed too loudly, then assured him everything was fine, but her fingers shook as she walked back to the car. The next day, she found the business card. It was stuffed in the kitchen trash, half buried under coffee grounds and grape stems, embossed. In gold foil, Adrienne Solari, Acquisitions Director, Maison Grand. A luxury conglomerate based in Paris known for buying boutique vineyards and stripping them for parts. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Maison Grand had approached them years ago. Charles had said no. Said they'd never sell to anyone who didn't care about the land. Had Claire contacted them again? Had Charles changed his mind? She confronted Claire in the tasting room. "Are we in talks with Maison Grand?" Claire didn't flinch. She just blinked, Greater than they reached out. I took the meeting as a courtesy. A courtesy? This is our family's legacy. Greater than, is it? Claire's voice was even. Too even, because all I see is a legacy buried under outdated ideas. Eleanor felt something collapse in her chest. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was war. Morgan stayed quiet through it all. She followed Claire into rooms, nodded when prompted, rarely spoke her own thoughts. Once, Eleanor caught her alone in the vineyard, tracing her fingers along the vines. Greater than, do you agree with this? Eleanor asked. Softly. Morgan didn't answer. She just looked away, eyes full of something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Fear? Regret? Loyalty? It didn't matter. Silence was enough. Charles, meanwhile, was slipping. There were good days when he smiled at Eleanor and squeezed her hand, and bad ones where he seemed far away. Eyes clouded, barely remembering names. Eleanor tried to talk to him about the business. They're making changes, she whispered one night. Do you know what Claire's doing? He didn't answer, or maybe he did, and she just didn't understand the words anymore. Claire always arrived 5 minutes later, offering medication, adjusting pillows, intercepting conversations. The vineyard felt different. The air was thicker, the staff quieter, even the grapes plump with summer felt, like they hung heavier on the vines. Eleanor still walked the rows each morning, notebook in hand, but now people averted their eyes, like she was already gone, like her era had ended, and no one told her. She tried to reclaim footing, scheduled a meeting with the board herself, but when she arrived, the chairs were full and Claire sat at the head of the table. Greater than, oh, she said lightly. I sent a calendar update. We moved it to earlier. Without telling me. Claire didn't blink. It was just operational. Nothing creative. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the vineyard office. She stared at the old corkboard, the same one she'd hung in Claire's childhood office. It still had the words CEO in training, written in her own faded handwriting. She took a deep breath. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to admit it. She was being erased. But what Claire didn't know was that Eleanor had always known how to survive a storm. She had done it with Charles, with harvest seasons, with heartbreaks, and she would do it again. This time, not to hold on, but to take it all back. The house still smelled like Charles, faint traces of cedar and vanilla. His favorite cologne lingered in the hallway, the wine. Glasses from the wake were still drying on the rack, sympathy cards stacked in uneven piles on the kitchen table. Untouched. Eleanor hadn't changed out of black. She moved to her home like a shadow, not crying, not speaking. Just moving, breathing, trying to keep the quiet from becoming unbearable. That morning, Claire called her into the dining room. She was already seated, laptop open, folders stacked neatly beside her, hair pinned tightly back like it was any other workday. Morgan stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes on the floor. Mom, Claire said gently, I know this is difficult, but there are things we need to go over. Eleanor blinked. Greater than, you want to talk about the business today? Claire didn't flinch. Dad would have wanted us to be organized. We're doing this for you. Eleanor sat down slowly, the chair cold against her spine. Claire slid a manila folder across the table. These are the succession documents. They just formalize the structure going forward. Eleanor opened it. Line after line of legal phrasing dents. Sanitized, calculated. The vineyard's operational control. Now assigned to Claire. The board voting shares. Shifted in majority to Claire and Morgan jointly. Her name. Listed under Creative Advisor Emeritus, a consulting role. No. Shares. No stake. No authority. Just a monthly honorarium of $3,000. Severance dressed in politeness. Her heart thudded in her ears. What is this? Claire's tone was calm, rehearsed, greater than a way forward. We need to protect the business, streamline. Leadership, you've done so much and now you can rest. Travel, paint again. Morgan still hadn't looked at her. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she flipped to the final page, where the signatures waited like little betrayals. Charles' name, not forged, not stamped, signed, real, filed days before his death. Eleanor. Looked up, greater than, you did this while he was dying. Claire exhaled, greater than, we did this because he was dying. You weren't thinking clearly, Mom. You were overwhelmed, and the vineyard needed direction. So you cut me out. We secured it for the future. The words rang with boardroom detachment. As if loyalty could be itemized. But it wasn't just the business. Later that afternoon, Eleanor went to log into the company account to pull a spreadsheet. A client contact something. Her password had been changed, greater than security update. Claire emailed. We're consolidating digital access to prevent confusion. She was locked out of every system, email, payroll, inventory logs. Vendor networks, she didn't exist anymore. That night, she went to pour herself a glass of wine, her husband's favorite vintage. Silent Oak 2013. The bottle was gone. So was the entire row of them. She walked to the study, heart pounding, opened the safe behind the bookshelf. Empty. The deed to the house. Gone. A quick search of county records the next morning confirmed the rest. The house had been moved into a trust, controlled by Claire and Morgan. It wasn't just a restructuring. It was a full extraction. Eleanor had not been asked. She had been removed from the home she built. The business she birthed, the family she gave everything to. She confronted Claire in the vineyard that afternoon. The sky was cloudy, the air still, greater than, how long have you been planning this? Claire didn't answer immediately. She touched the edge of a ripening grape cluster, almost absently, greater than, Dad asked me to protect the vineyard. No, Eleanor. Snapped, he asked me. And look where that got us, Claire said quietly. You were painting labels while we bled money. You cared more about poetry than projections. Because poetry is what people remember. No, Mom, people remember success. It wasn't rage that gripped Eleanor. It was something colder, grief, betrayal, disbelief, that the same girl she once taught to recognize the scent of crushed violets in a barrel of Pinot was now erasing her from history. Morgan approached her later that evening, quiet, nervous. She brought tea, Eleanor's favorite blend. Set it down gently, like a peace offering, greater than, I didn't want to do it this way. Eleanor looked at her youngest daughter, the one who used to leave handwritten notes in her coat pocket, who once cried when a grapevine died during frost, greater than, then why didn't you stop her? Morgan swallowed hard, greater than, because I'm not Claire. The heartbreak was complete, not because she had lost assets or votes, but because she realized with perfect clarity her daughters had chosen legacy over love, and they had done it with legal precision. The house that night felt colder than it ever had. Eleanor sat in her studio, surrounded by half-finished sketches, labels that would never print, memories that would never matter to them again. She poured a glass of water. Stared out the window at the vineyard, the rows of vines glowing silver in the moonlight. It was all hers, and now none of it was. But as the night wore on, the silence began to shift. No more grief. No more confusion. Only a single growing clarity. If they wanted a legacy without her name, then she'd give them exactly that. She would vanish from the history they were trying to rewrite and make sure that in the version the world remembered, she was the story. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't call a liar in a frenzy or storm into meetings demanding her name back. There were no fights, no threats, no dramatic ultimatums. She simply went quiet. Stopped attending tastings, stopped replying to emails. Stopped answering Claire's stiff, duty-bound phone calls. At first, they thought she was broken. Claire even told a friend, greater than, she'd come around. She just needs time to grieve. But Eleanor wasn't grieving. She was planning. She began in the basement, among the forgotten ledgers, harvest logs, and dust-covered barrels. She found the old wooden file box, Charles' original paperwork from the founding years, flicking through yellowing contracts and typed memos. She found it, the co-founding agreement, dated 3 months after their wedding. Signed jointly. One clause jumped out, highlighted faintly in faded green ink, greater than, in the event of death, divorce, or dissolution, all creative property and branding associated with Whitmore White shall remain co-owned with prior artistic claims, reverting to original source unless otherwise reassigned. She stared at it for a long time, but she wasn't done yet. Upstairs, buried deep in her studio closet, she found something even more powerful. A signed amendment file just 7 months before Charles' death, drafted by their estate attorney. Approved by Charles. It granted Eleanor permanent ownership of the name Whitmore White, all label, art, and poetry, any prose, folklore, or language used in marketing tied to Eleanor's authorship, all design elements tied to her artistic identity. Claire had combed through stock holdings, voting rights, and real estate, but she had missed the soul of the brand, and Eleanor owned the soul. 2 weeks later, a discreet envelope arrived at Claire's office, a formal intellectual property injunction filed with the county court and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. The notice was simple, greater than, you may not sell, distribute, or advertise any product using the name Whitmore White, its artwork, or any language previously authored by Eleanor White, effective immediately. Claire's jaw clenched so tightly she cracked a molar. The brand, everything she had marketed, scaled, rebranded, and budgeted, was now legally frozen. She called Eleanor. "You're doing this to punish me?" Eleanor's voice was calm. "No, I'm just reclaiming what's mine. You'll ruin us." "You already did." Click. Claire tried to fight it, tried to pivot quickly, rebranding under a sterile new name. White Vineyards. Ink. But without the familiar label, without the story. The brand flopped. Wine influencers stopped posting. Vendors hesitated. Longtime customers said the new labels looked like supermarket knockoffs. Because the wine hadn't just been grapes and glass. It had been her poetry, her brushstrokes, her soul in a bottle. Meanwhile, Eleanor resurfaced, not with vengeance, not with noise, but with elegance. Soft launch event held in the original tasting room, which she'd quietly repurchased using a trust her daughters never knew existed. No press. Just candles, handwritten invitations, the brand. Eleanor's Harvest, a return to the beginning. She opened with a vintage Charles had once called her love letter in a bottle. The label, her original 1996 watercolor of their first harvest, never before release. Beneath it, in delicate script, greater than, for the ones who still believe in memory. Word spread fast. The community rallied. Old sommeliers posted about her return. Influencers filmed poetic montages of her labels. Former vendors called, asking for contracts, not out of pity, but loyalty. Even Morgan showed up uninvited on the third day of sales. She stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding a bottle of Claire's now defunct product. Eleanor looked at her once, greater than, I hope someday you understand what you lost. Morgan never stepped inside. Within 3 months, White Vineyards, Inc. collapsed. Retail partners dropped out. Social engagement tanked. A luxury conglomerate, Maison Grand, rescinded its interest publicly, citing brand instability. Claire tried to pivot again, this time into spirits, but the name meant nothing now, because meaning had never been hers to begin with. Eleanor never gloated. She didn't speak ill of her daughters in interviews, didn't post cryptic quotes, didn't Sell revenge. She simply told her story. In poems, on corks, unlimited edition prints, sold with every bottle. Each label ended with one line, greater than some roots grow deeper when cut. It's quiet now. Not empty. Just peaceful. The land still blooms. The grapes still ripen. And the wind still hums through the rose. Like a lullaby only Eleanor understands. But this is no longer Whitmore Vineyards. This is Harvest House, a place not for commerce, but for healing. The rebranding was subtle. No press release, no interviews, just a wooden sign carved by hand, hung on the old barn gate. Harvest House for the stories. We grow, that's what Eleanor calls it now. Not a business, not a winery, a sanctuary, a space where writers come to rest, to reflect, to put pain into prose. She hosts seasonal retreats, nothing flashy. Just 10 people at a time. Old cottages, warm food, notebooks waiting on every pillow. It's become a haven for the brokenhearted and the wide-eyed alike. And Eleanor? She's finally herself again. She doesn't talk about Claire or Morgan unless asked out. When she does, her voice stays soft, greater than they were good girls once, ambitious, hurting, lost. She never pressed charges. Never contested their final desperate attempts to regain footing. Never demanded an apology. She didn't need one. The world saw, the industry whispered, people knew what happened. They saw the headlines, the retraction statements, the downfall, but Eleanor never celebrated it. She just moved forward. She still walks the vineyard every morning. Same boots, same path, notebook in hand, sketching lines of poetry between the vines. The staff greets her with respect, not pity. Volunteers help with harvest every fall. They say working for her feels like working with something sacred because the soil remembers. Her. The land forgives, and the grapes still carry her name and spirit, if not on the label. In late autumn, a letter arrives. No return address. Inside, a pressed violet. One word in Morgan's handwriting, greater than sorry. Eleanor places it in her journal, doesn't write back. Some doors, once closed, remained shut, not out of bitterness, but peace. One night, she hosts a fireside reading at the retreat. She reads from a leather-bound journal, the same one she wrote in during Charles' final days. The guests sit silently, wine in hand, faces lit by flickering flame. She closes the book, looks up. And smiles. They thought legacy was something you could steal, but roots don't grow in greed. They grow in love, and mine run deeper than they'll ever know. If you've ever been betrayed but didn't stay broken, like, comment, and subscribe. You deserve your own ending.